Konnichiwa, Mugen Gumi e yokoso. Goshicho arigatou gozaimasu. Howdy and welcome to Mugen Gumi. I'm Asakame. Thank you for viewing. In this session, we're going to wrap up the openings. We've done 2 static rook openings so far. The Bolgin opening, where your rook remains static and the silver proceeds up the pole, which is basically the rook's file, to engage. The second opening, the Yagura, was also a static rook opening, and this was an intentionally defensive posture. This time, we're going to do a mobile rook opening, which is also highly offensive in nature, and can manifest itself in several different ways. The specific file into which you move the rook, or Hisha, is dependent on what exactly you're trying to accomplish, or the method that you're trying to accomplish winning the game. You have Nakabisha, which is putting the rook in the center of the board, basically in front of the king's original position anyway, and working from there. And you have Mukai Bisha, where the rook or Hisha is placed in the same file as your opponent's rook. And then there's the files in between, which are also fair game. So this particular example is eventually going to get to a Mukai Bisha type of arrangement. In the meantime, you're going to see the opponent deeply entrench his emperor or Osama in the opposite corner of the board, basically. And we're going to pretty much leave it at that point. But what it will illustrate is getting the game started, and then provide a couple of pointers as to how it might proceed from that point. Well, all right then, let's get started. As you can see, I already have the pieces arrayed on the board, or koma on the board, and black is always the challenger and is the first move. White is in defense and is the second move. So, opening move, fairly bold kind of move. This opens the diagonal for the bishop or kaku, and you will see that what will happen is that white will do exactly the same thing. Now this opens the possibility of a quick exchange of kaku or bishops, and from this point the game can get very unpredictable, because once this happens, then both of these are available for play and could be dropped anywhere. Now this isn't a particularly good example, but it's just interesting in that, you know, immediately you can put your opponent in check. Now this was easy to counter, either this way, or even this way. So it's not worth doing, but a few moves later, it could be very interesting. So some games start this way, but this one is not going to. And so I'm going to refuse. And what this does is it interposes the pawn or fu in between. If he takes it, obviously you can take his bishop or kaku, and it'd be a very uneven exchange. So that's not going to happen. So instead, now that he's been thwarted, he's going to start a more conventional offense. So this looks as if he's going to try a static rook opening at this time. And we'll see how far he gets with that. Okay. So we're going to move kin, or gold, up adjacent to the bishop or kaku. So this is starting to solidify the protection that we have in place on this side of the board. Strangely enough, your opponent's going to do exactly the same thing. And then we're going to strengthen this particular point on the board, though of course, you know, king can cover all of these squares as well. So, but it does solidify the defensive strength at this point right here. Your opponent doesn't care much and is going to continue developing the static rook opening. So it's time to put an end to that. That pretty decisively will dash his aims here unless he's willing to focus more pieces in this area. We're testing his resolve. So instead what happens is, oops, not that side, this side. Yeah. Going to further develop his own defenses. And this is where your rook comes across. So in a way, your opponent helped you out by giving you the excuse to move in the first place. You were going to do this anyway. And so that you open the entire rank for the Hisha or rook to move like this. And so it's not quite Mukai Bisha, but it's the adjacent file. Okay. All right. And your opponent finally closes the diagonal here. Okay. Now time to develop your own defense. So this happens. And this is why I think the separation between the pawn rank and most of the pieces is like this to enable the castle. Okay. And your opponent moves king or gold in front of the emperor or Osama. And this just continues to unfold on this side. And your opponent starts copying, just out of sheer prudence. And same go, continue. And your opponent pushes gheen or silver forward in front of the king or gold. And if you'll remember, this arrangement here is very similar to what would have happened had you gone ahead and tried a static rook opening. All these characters here are basically the same. And the position of the emperor is close also. And then, now that Osama's passed, you close the door behind him with gheen or silver. Okay. Okay. Your opponent moves his gold or king to this position here. So as you can see, this is a stout defensive position here. Okay. And then you counter by moving your gheen or silver to this position, so just diagonally. White moves kaku or the bishop to the back row or rank. So he's changing the diagonal. Okay. Advance a pawn. Advance the same pawn. Now he's exposed that diagonal. No worries. You still have. He's threatening here, but you still have K, or your knight, and Kyosha, or your lancer, both of whom can cover. So no worries there. Given that your opponent is showing signs of making threats in this general direction, though, it's time to better expose your Hisha, or Rook, and this is the position in which to do it. And now you see that we have achieved Mukai Bisha. They're in opposition now. Okay, and that opens some possibilities for white now. So there's the direct threat on this side, and then there's the possibility of a threat going to the opposite side of the board as well, involving the same pawn on the opposite side. Okay. So the next move is to move silver to the center of the board in the third rank up. White moves Osama, or the Emperor, further into the defensive position there. Okay. Advance another pawn. And then white completes defensive preparations there. So you can see that it's going to be a somewhat protracted battle to dig white out of all of this in order to win the game. So he's truly thrown down the gauntlet and said, come dig me out if you can. Okay. Then we move silver here. This pawn comes forward, and then we do this. All right, and so what you see here is that both sides have created fairly stout defenses for their emperor, or Osama. You can argue that whites are stouter, but there's a lot of mutual support going on here as well. On black side of the board, silver or Gin is covered by gold or King back here, and then these are mutually supportive. And these are also mutually supportive. So it's a good position all the way around. Now, what's likely to happen after here? We could expect that black's going to open this position so that K, or the knight, can move there, and then possibly start something right here to start picking at the flank here. Now, having said that, white does have many tools in his arsenal by which to possibly thwart this. One move of which could be to get Kaku, or the bishop, over here. So that's gonna force adjustments on black's part, because you'll get a discovered check situation here if this threat turns into something more than a threat, as in you're basically giving a pawn scot-free because you can't do that. You discover check that way. So, but this is a fairly standard type of opening, and it becomes very dynamic, and you do see that the relatively slow tempo of development allows both sides to create fairly strong defenses. Well, all right then. So that's an example of a mobile rook opening. Character of the game slightly different. Getting that rook over to the side creates different possibilities than exist with respect to how the game proceeds if the rook remains in or near the original file in which the piece was played. And so it's considered a somewhat more advanced game, but it's worth your knowing early on, as you may get exposed to it sooner than you might expect, depending on who and when you play. So it's worth seeing what that looks like and kind of taking a little time to think through how you might address that type of opening if you're on the receiving end of it. So that pretty much wraps up the openings, the set openings that I'm going to show you. I think for the next several sessions I'm going to set up a mid to end game scenario and walk through the moves involved there to further develop the game, possibly to take it to completion as well. And so that may take 3, perhaps 4 sessions to demonstrate some of those, just to give some further exposure into the various combinations of moves that are at least considered more or less orthodox within Shogi. Well, I certainly hope you've enjoyed this session as much as I've enjoyed putting it together. This one was a little bit different and a little more challenging in terms of the complexity of what's going on the board. And it's only going to get a little more complex as we go along. But this one did pose some special challenges in terms of getting ready for this. So I also hope that you're able to follow along in some way, having either obtained a shogi set or been able to fabricate one out of heavy cardstock. Works pretty well, because the mechanical process involved in following is very supportive to being able to learn the game. I think it's much more difficult to follow what's going on if everything remains in the abstract. Again, I think, but I just think it'd be very helpful. So until next time, o genki de.